Okay, well, good morning, everyone, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. Um, Scholars have struggled for decades to answer basic questions about civil society organizations. Ethnographers have identified important social and cultural dynamics that take place at meetings, events, and activities, but we actually have little idea about how often those dynamics occur because survey research and other large N data collection techniques can't see social interaction and culture. To solve this problem, my colleagues and I have adapted systematic social observation to the study of civil society organizations. The technique produces comparable, quantitative, observational data from large numbers of observable settings. Our pilot studies show that collecting data in this way will provide a clearer understanding about the frequency of social and cultural dynamics in civil society and will allow for tests of the impact of these dynamics on individual and organizational outcomes. With that, thanks again for having me. My name is Matthew Baggetta, coming to you live this morning from Indiana University's O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. And I'm really excited to talk with you today about systematic social observation of civil society, or really, as my introduction suggested, of civil society organizations. I'll note in a moment that's sort of the primary focus of a lot of civil society research. So a quick preview of where we're headed today. I'm going to start by giving a very brief overview of the study of civil society organizations and some of the limitations that we have there in terms of the way that we collect data on it. We've got techniques that provide small numbers of cases or small windows into large numbers of cases, and we kind of miss a lot in between. Second, I'll introduce a new middle range method that I think can fill the gap there, called systematic social observation. It's a technique that's been used for a long time in a lot of different ways, but has never really been applied to civil society organizations before. I'll talk about how we went about adapting systematic social observation for civil society organizations. I'll give you a very brief introduction to what the research tool looks like at this point, and then I'll provide some illustrative results from a couple of pilot studies that we've completed using these techniques. One of them is going to show you variation at the convening level, so variation across meetings, events, and activities, and another one is going to focus on variation across organizations once we combine data up to the organization level. I'll wrap up at the end by talking about what's next, where we're headed with this research, the kind of projects that we want to do to expand the number of cases that are collected and the kinds of analyses we can conduct. And I'm also going to suggest that you might be a part of what's next and invite you in to join in using this kind of technique going forward. So with that, a brief introduction to studying civil society organizations. First, what are civil society organizations? What do I mean when I say this? Well, CSOs are formal organizations whose participants voluntarily assemble to pursue common purposes. Kind of a technical definition. They're also known across the academic literature as voluntary associations, civic associations, membership-based organizations, interest groups. It's a big set of nonprofit organizations. Different fields talk about these organizations in different kinds of ways, so you might be familiar with different words that all mean roughly the same thing. CSOs, therefore, include things of a really wide range, from hobby groups to business associations, religious congregations, advocacy groups, local sports teams, you name it. All of these sort of voluntary groups fall under the umbrella of CSOs. Now, these have been a focus for a very long time in the scholarly literature. Go all the way back to Alexis de Tocqueville, the sort of patron saint of this field. In some of the most cited passages from Tocqueville's Democracy in America, he talks about the importance of CSOs for training democratic citizens, for holding the state accountable to citizen interests, and for connecting communities together. There's been plenty of research that is built on that Tocquevillian tradition. A couple of the greatest hits here in front of you. Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, Theda Skocpol's Diminished Democracy. Books like these all agree that important things are going on inside CSOs. And they often track the long-term trends in the number of these organizations that are active in a country or in a region. But they often don't have data that really lets them look inside those CSOs and know what's going on, and if they really understand what's actually happening inside all of those organizations that they can track the numbers of. And here's why. If we think about this as a civil society organization out there, what we often want to know are the internal dynamics. Who's in that organization? What are they doing? How are they doing it? What are they talking about? How are they talking about the things that they're talking about? Now, these techniques, ethnography, participant observation, can give us that data. Right? And they give us that by having a researcher literally go inside those organizations and watch what's going on, take copious field notes, collect that all to be able to discuss all of those internal dynamics. Now, there's fantastic examples of this in the field, from classics like Nina Eliasov's Avoiding Politics, to stuff that's hot off the presses, like Paul Lichterman's new book, How Civic Action Works, and Suzanne Stagenborg's new book on grassroots environmentalism. These are ethnographers, participant observers who've spent years sometimes in organizations getting exactly this kind of data. The well-known challenge with these approaches, though, of course, is that there's a limitation on the number of cases that you can really do this kind of work with. Stagenborg, for example, looks at 5 or 6 organizations. She looks at them over a very long period of time, and you get a tremendous amount of detail about what's going on inside them. But you can't really know the full scope of how often those dynamics are taking place across all the organizations in some population, because we're really only getting data from a few of them. There are other kinds of techniques in the field, though, that give us that large N approach, insights across many different organizations. There's lots of different approaches that have been used to try and get this broader scope. Some people use administrative records, things like city directories that list all the various organizations that have been in a city over time. Some people compile histories written about different organizations and try and extract data from those that would allow you to compare organizations to one another. Some people study organization documents, things like meeting minutes or newsletters, to get the insights that you can glean out of those. Some people conduct key informant interviews where they talk to 1 or 2 leaders from an organization and get their perspectives on what's going on. And also quite popular are surveys of members or participants in organizations, broad scale surveys that give people a lot of opportunity to get a very general sense of what's going on. Here's a few of the greatest hits in the field that use these kinds of approaches. Jason Kaufman's book, For the Common Good, uses those city directories to talk about the sort of ecosystem of civil society organizations in cities over time. Mark Shave's book, Congregations in America, used key informant interviews to find out how congregations work and the kinds of things that are going on in them. And Verber, Schlotzman, and Brady's classic volume, Voice and Equality, used a very large survey of citizens in the US to get a sense of the kinds of organizations they participate in, the kinds of experiences they might have in those, and how that connects to their political participation. Now, the great thing about these kinds of approaches is they give you this kind of insight, right? We get lots and lots of organizations, and we can get comparisons that really give you some sense of scope. Unfortunately, each one of these techniques, though, only gives you a window into what's going on in any particular organization. And many times the window is just really, really small. Administrative records from those city directories, oftentimes they only include the organization's name. And so we have to just kind of guess based on that what went on in the meetings and events and activities of that organization based on what it called itself and what we might know from a few other sources about information about organizations similar to that one. Member surveys, on the other end, again, sort of give you the opportunity to ask people about their experiences, but you're getting a very small slice of what's actually happening there. So these kinds of sources, the administrative records, the histories, the organizational documents, they're usually either providing insights from external observers looking at an organization or by elites within an organization who are writing something for a very specific audience and for a narrow purpose. That often makes these kinds of sources hard to compare across organizations. And to the extent that you can, you get very limited insight into what actually went on in them. Interviews and surveys have the nice advantage of being designed by a researcher, so you can actually get the data that you want, but it asks a lot of the respondents. When you're asking someone in an interview to tell you about all the kinds of things that go on within an organization, or if you're asking one particular member in a survey to report on what their organization is like in general, they have to do an awful lot of recall, and they're going to give you a very sort of homogenized view, right? They have to average together in their head all the experiences that they've had in different kinds of meetings and events and activities. It's very hard to get them to report on any one meeting, event, or activity in a particularly detailed kind of way, and to ask them to do that for multiple different events is extremely hard. I actually saw this a lot in my own dissertation research, more years ago now than I'd like to admit. I was studying community choirs in the Boston area, and what I had designed there was a field survey. I attended things that looked like this, right? Rehearsals of these community choirs throughout the Boston area. And I brought with me an 8-page survey that I handed out to everybody who was in attendance at the time. And I would say, all right, please fill out my survey and answer these questions about your organization. And then I collected the surveys and brought them on back. And I was really excited when I designed the study because I'm like, wow, I'm going to get such great detailed data about what goes on in these meetings. And literally, as I was handing out the surveys and having people fill them out, I would look around the room and realize just how much I was going to miss because of what I could see while I was there that I knew was not going to be captured by the survey and never could. Because the kinds of things that I could see because I was this outside observer who was now in this space. The people who were there were participants. They were worried about singing or making decisions about how the organization would run. They couldn't step back from what was going on to really see the broader social significance of what was taking place. So coming out of that experience and my reading of the literature generally, what I wanted to do was try and find a way to bridge the gap, to get some of those insights that you can get from having observers who are inside the organization while things are going on, but also get the benefit of a larger scope of those larger end methods. So that's what have been working on for the last several years is adapting a new middle range method, systematic social observation. I think this approach gives us the chance to sort of bridge that gap between those other kinds of techniques. Now, what is systematic social observation? It's a data collection technique that uses trained independent observers and standardized protocols and forms to collect detailed, comparable, quantitative data from many theoretically similar settings. There's a lot here. Let me unpack it a little bit. The trained independent observers getting detailed information, that's the kind of thing that ethnography and participant observation often provides. You've got people who are ready and focused on a certain set of research questions to be able to go on in and look for that stuff in a setting without actually having to be deeply engaged in running the organization at the time that they're trying to do that. And they can collect detailed information that they planned ahead to collect. On the other side, having standardized forms and protocols for what you're going to code and how you're going to code it makes the data comparable, and you get to collect it in a quantitative format. That comes in as a set of characteristics that are more similar to surveys, right? Where you've planned out what you're getting ahead of time, you're not going to be working inductively, and you're going to be able to get a larger amount of directly comparable information from every setting. And doing so then lets you get many more observations than you might be able to get out of a traditional ethnographic kind of approach. Now, the word many is kind of a loaded one here. This is a relative term. Systematic social observation is a labor-intensive technique, right? You're taking people and you're sending them on out to all of these different events. So it can be both time-consuming and expensive, which means you're probably not going to use this technique to reach something that's going to give you the scope of really large survey studies, sort of tens of thousands of cases. But you definitely are going to come in more than a traditional ethnography that's going to be able to look at 8 or 10 cases at the outer bounds of what one ethnographer could do. So it's important to think about the sort of study N for this technique as kind of falling in between those ranges. More cases than ethnography, less than large survey or administrative data sets. There have been some really prominent examples of successful systematic social observation studies in the past. A few of my favorites are Albert Rees's study, the Police and the Public. It was focused on police-public interactions. His observers went on ride-alongs with police on the beat and coded everything that went on in interactions between police and citizens. William H. White's study of public spaces, especially in New York City, where he focused a lot of his attention, is a super fascinating study of how parks and plazas and other public spaces work and what makes for good ones and less used ones throughout the city. Paco Underhill, who was a student of William H. White, went on years later to do studies of retail shopping environments and find out what it is about the design of spaces and the ways that people interact with those that increases or decreases the chances that we actually buy things when we're out shopping. And perhaps most recently and notably, Robert Sampson, in his study of Chicago, used systematic social observation to study Chicago's neighborhoods, particularly looking for examples of urban disorder. And he managed to collect data of a sort of broken windows type that really highlighted the fact that what we might have thought of in the past as broken windows dynamics really ended up being sort of racialized perceptions of disorder in Chicago. So really added a lot to that literature there. Now, arguably, all of these sources are sort of looking at aspects of civil society, but none of them, and really no others that I've found so far, actually use the technique going inside civil society organizations to collect what's going on in there. So that's what we've made happen over the last few years. And I'll describe now our attempts to sort of adapt systematic social observation for civil society organizations, or to say that in a less mouthfully kind of way, adapting SSO for CSOs. First, we have to decide what we're actually going to observe when you're going to use this technique. The units of data collection have to be theoretically similar so that the data will really be comparable across each time that you go out and collect the data. What we study, we call convenings. A convening, in formal terms, is the intentional assembly of two or more people for some public purpose under the auspices of an at least quasi-formal organization. The less formal definition that might be a little easier to hang on to is that convenings are all of the meetings, events, and activities held by CSOs. It's important to note that these are intentional things, though, things that they plan to have. Convenings are not unplanned encounters. So if you have members of a CSO who bump into each other on the street, that doesn't count as a convening. That wasn't a planned thing. These are the sort of regularly scheduled meetings, events, and activities that these organizations have that appear on a schedule and that you can go out and observe. We did 2 pilot studies to help develop a tool that would allow us to collect data in a systematic social observation framework from CSOs. The first one was a study of college student associations that we conducted at a large Midwestern university in the United States that shall remain nameless. We assembled and trained a team of observers, students who would fit in at student CSO convenings. I actually did the first few observations myself, and it was pretty clear that having a faculty member that students would recognize there changed the dynamics just a bit too much. So all of our observations in the student study were conducted by student observers who, once they went out, actually blended in pretty remarkably, and participants in the situation rarely engaged with them after they showed up. Over 4 months, we collected fully qualitative field notes and then distilled those into our initial quantitative categories, closed-ended items that we would be able to look for out there in other convenings. And then over 14 months, we conducted a series of cycles of field testing and revision. So we would send out our observers, they would go to a set of convenings, they would code everything that they could on the form as we had it. Every couple of weeks, we would take a look then and debrief with them and say, all right, what's working, what's not? What are things that are easy to code? What are things that you're just having trouble finding? What are things that you're seeing that the form doesn't capture? And what are things that are on the form that we're just never really going to be able to get? And we would make changes, then send them back out to the field and do it again. As we went through that process, we were also collecting data, right? We assembled all the data that they got in all of those formats. But each time that the form changed, that meant some of the data from earlier in the study would be basically not comparable at all to things that we would collect later. In the end, we ended up with 126 observations across 17 organizations. And those organizations really ran the gamut, from issue advocacy groups to recreational sports clubs. One of them literally was a Quidditch team. It was awesome. The output from that study ended up a 9-page paper coding form with 102 items and a 40-page code book to go along with it. So we had a lot of materials that we produced out of that. And in terms of data, we ended up with 104 observations that had some viable quantitative data in them. But as I said before, the item ends, each item that we might have viable data for, varies quite a bit. Sometimes if something got added to one of those later versions, we've only got 10 or 20 cases there. But for some items that lasted the whole time, we might have upwards of 100 cases. The second pilot study, sort of building on what we did in that first study, was done in the city of Indianapolis. And here we studied community civil society organizations, because we don't want this just to focus on student groups. It needs to be broadly applicable across a very wide range of organizations to accomplish what we want. So we recruited 3 large CSOs in this case: a business association, a neighborhood council, and a community organizing coalition. Now, these organizations were interesting. All of them are actually organizations of organizations. So individuals don't join them. For the Community Organizing Coalition, typically it's a church or a community center that already has members that then joins the coalition. The Business Association, it's an association of businesses. The Neighborhood Council is a council formed of neighborhood associations and representatives from those coming together. So in each of these cases, the events and meetings and activities we were observing, we were looking at representatives from those organizations coming together. All of these were active organizations in the area. All of them are focused on community improvement, so they have a sort of similar focus, but they do take slightly different political positions as they approach these kinds of things. So the Business Association is sort of on the center right, the Community Organizing Coalition is on the center left, and the Neighborhood Council is sort of the center. So it was a nice sort of broad cut at political perspectives, as well as getting very active organizations in the sample. We assembled a team of observers and trained them, and our observers were diverse in gender, race and ethnicity, national origin, and a variety of other dimensions. And this was important because we needed to make sure that the tool would work, that anyone could go out and code things consistently, no matter what position you come from as an observer. Oftentimes we would send out pairs of observers with the same form to the same event so that they could code it at the same time, and that would let us know if we had items that weren't working for everybody or were more dependent on the coder, and we could adjust that so that everybody, no matter what position you're coming from, would code things in the same way. Over 15 months, we conducted another set of cycles of field testing and revision and data collection, much like we did in the student study. In the end, on this one, we ended up with 135 observations, but because of those paired observations that we did, we only really observed 99 convenings across these 3 organizations. And the output from this, we transferred into a digitized format. So now we have a digital coding form with 97 items that we group into 10 different modules. In terms of data, we came away with 99 data records from those convenings, but again, the item ends, they vary pretty substantially because we made revisions to the tool as we move forward. So let me tell you just a little bit about what this tool looks like now and the kinds of data we can collect with it. I told you it was digital. What we actually do is use Qualtrics survey software, typically used for online surveys. And we build our whole system right there in the online survey system. And then what we do with our observers is send them out essentially with a low budget iPad, something that looks essentially like this. And they complete that online survey right there on the tablet computer that they have in front of them. So again, sort of participants aren't filling out the survey, our observers are, and they're trained for what to look for and how to fill out the survey in a consistent way. The nice format about this is as soon as they're done doing it, they hit submit, it gets stored in the cloud. We never have to worry about sort of paper forms being lost or other problems along those lines. And the data is ready for us to immediately start cleaning it and dealing with it on the back end. In terms of the content, there's tons in there. It would take me hours to go through it all. So I'm going to do sort of a blazingly fast overview just of the sort of major themes, those 10 modules that make up the tool at this point. We look at aspects of physical space. So not only where an event takes place, but the arrangement of furniture, the size of the space, the ways that people are interacting with it, the technology that's available to people. We do a lot of focus on participants. So we count how many people are there. We count before the convening starts and after it ends. We also try to collect demographic characteristics to the extent that we can observe those things. And then we use that data to look at cross interactions. One of the big theoretical questions in this area that is really under researched empirically is the extent to which interaction across lines of demographic difference actually happens in civil society organizations. There's a big democratic hope that that's the case. And so we can actually look at that and track it in the settings that we're observing. And so that's one of the things we capture in there. We focus a bit on leadership. So who is exercising leadership, what their characteristics are, and how much of the time that they're spending doing that. We look at social boundaries that are drawn by members during the course of a convening. So the kinds of things that they say that establish who's in the in group and who's in the out group and what kinds of groups are contested for membership within this organization. We talk a lot about procedures and norms, so the kinds of practices that govern what goes on at these meetings and events. And there's pretty substantial variation on this that we see. We look at the activities, the sort of huge range of things that actually can take place at this. We focus a lot on deliberation and decisions, so the kinds of things that people talk about, how they talk about them, what kinds of things they consider making a decision about, whether or not they actually come to a clear decision at the end of that becomes a particularly interesting thing to look at. We look a little bit at the public sphere's focus of what goes on. So a lot of theorists of civil society hope that people are coming together in these organizations and at least some of the time talking about events and news that are happening beyond the organization. And so we look to what extent is that actually happening, or to what extent are participants mostly focusing on things that are just going on internally based on whatever the organization is about. And then the last big thing we look at is sort of interaction styles, so differences in the kinds of organizational cultures, how people talk to one another and how they interact. All right, with that as a quick backdrop, let me give a couple of illustrative results from the pilot study so you get a sense of the kind of data that we're getting and the kinds of things we've done with it so far. At the moment, our results are just descriptive. Our effective ends are relatively small, again, because of changes in the form over the course of the time that we collected data. But what we're doing here, right, is laying a foundation for broader scale data collection that can be connected to other data sources to answer bigger analytic questions. One way to think about the descriptive and analytic potential of the data that we're collecting is to think about the fact that convening level data are actually useful at multiple levels of analysis. So I'll show two examples of what I mean here. Example one is going to come from the college student organization study. And there I'm going to talk about convening level variation. So we're just going to imagine every convening that we looked at as an independent observation and think about the variation across those. The second example is going to come from the Indianapolis study of community organizations. And there we're going to aggregate convening level data up to the organization level so that we can start looking at differences across organizations and getting some sense of variation across that. So starting with example one, again, we're talking about college student organizations and looking at variation across convenings. This data that I'm going to present and the analysis I'm going to present comes from this paper, Systematic Social Observation in the Study of Civil Society Organizations. I published this paper a couple of years ago, although it's just out in print this year with my colleague, David Bredenkamp, and that paper is out in Sociological Methods and Research. This analysis is one of several that's included in the paper. The data that we're going to look at here is connecting data on physical space along with data on participants, so those first two modules that are in the form now. And the question that I'm going to ask is a pretty simple one. It's basically, how often do convenings fit their spaces? So to think about fit, here's this table. Across the top, I'm going to show you ranges of participants. So we've got small convenings, just 2 to 10 participants who are attending them, to very large ones, convenings with more than 100 people who have attended them. And then down the side, I'm going to give you some sense of the sizes of the spaces where those convenings took place. So those range from intimate spaces, spaces that are really designed for 2 to 10 people, up to very large spaces, like very large lecture halls that could hold hundreds of people within them and would be appropriate for those very large kinds of settings. We also observed a few convenings that happened outside, and of course there the boundary issues are very different, but I'll show you that data as well. Now, theoretically speaking, if the world worked the way it ought to, we would probably see something. I'm going to show you column percentages here, so you will see the percentage of each convening size that happened within each of those spaces. And in an ideal world, right, we would expect to see something like this, right, where generally speaking, convenings of a particular size are taking place in the space that's right for the size of those. Small convenings happen in intimate spaces, medium-sized convenings happen in medium-sized spaces. Admittedly, with the outside thing in there, it ought to look something like this, with some of them taking place outside, but whatever, it's going to be easier to think about it if we just imagine this as the ideal world. If this is the ideal, then we would think that anything that sort of falls down below that diagonal is essentially too much space for the convening that you're taking place in. You don't need that much space, and arguably you're going to have a weird social dynamic if you're spreading out in that space or sitting clustered together in a cavernous space surrounding you. The flip side of that is anything above that diagonal is going to be too little space. There we've got the sardines problem, where everybody's going to be in there and they're going to be packed in too tight, which also could change the dynamics of what's going on. We were just interested to see how often do these things kind of play out. So in terms of real data, here's what we've got. When you look at very large convenings, admittedly, we only had 4 of them, so the ends here are small, but all of those fit in large indoor spaces, and they were doing exactly what we thought. So great, that worked out pretty well. As you move down that diagonal, though, things changed quite a bit. 63% of the sort of medium-sized convenings were in medium-sized spaces. And by the time you get down to intimate convenings, those very small ones with 2 to 10 people, only 4% of those were taking place in actually legitimately small spaces. So we were sort of expecting, as we went into this, that what we would really see then is quite a few in this green triangle at the top, where we would have people who were essentially shoehorning themselves into very small spaces. And that did happen a bit, but actually a lot less than we thought it would. Very often, you did not have those sort of problems of not enough space. It did happen 19% of the time for the medium-sized convenings, but not much more than that. Where we saw quite a bit more action was actually in convenings that were happening in spaces that were just too big for what was taking place. And in some cases, yes, the small number of participants were doing activities that required a little more space, but very often they weren't. They were sort of business meetings that were taking place in very large spaces, sometimes much, much larger than were going on. So if you take a look here, right, just focusing in, we had more than half of the convenings that had just between 2 and 10 people taking place in much, much larger spaces than they actually needed. And what we roughly observed there were very odd dynamics, where people would spread themselves out so that in a setting where everyone could have easily talked to one another, oftentimes they didn't. So quick findings out of this then, just descriptive, but still among the observed college student groups, the convenings very often did not fit the spaces very well. Smaller convenings were surprisingly likely to be held in oversized spaces. And this sort of generates a new hypothesis for us, which is the fit of a convening to its space might influence the level of participant interaction. This is actually a hypothesis we're looking into with some of the data from the second pilot study. We're kind of working on that now, so stay tuned. Those results hopefully will be coming together in the next couple of months. Example 2 is, as I said before, focused on community organizations and looking at organization level variation. This is data that's going to come out of this paper, just published this fall online in September, observing civic engagement using systematic social observation to study civil society organization convenings. This appeared in Voluntas, and as I said, just came out, published online a couple of months ago. Again, I'm just going to show you one of several sets of analyses from this paper. And here I'm going to focus on data on interaction style, so something that gets a little bit more at organizational culture. So easy question here, how much do CSOs vary in their interaction styles? And I'm going to show you just 3 of the sort of 10 or 12 measures that we collect on this. I'm going to show you the percentage of convenings for each organization where we saw the following 3 stylistic things occur. Did we see any hugging happen among participants? Did we see people interrupting one another during conversations? And did we see people essentially shout at each other? Did they raise their voices at any point in time? For our business association, we saw really low levels of shouting, a little bit of interrupting, and surprisingly, almost a quarter of them involved some amount of hugging, which honestly we didn't expect from the business association. But when you start comparing that to the other organizations, the business association still looks quite different. Our neighborhood council did a bit more shouting, a lot more interrupting. They talked over each other at almost 80% of the convenings that we looked at, and they were less huggy even than the business association. The community organizing coalition, on the other hand, has a very different kind of dynamic that takes place across their convenings. They're much more likely to raise their voices. They're every bit as likely to interrupt one another as in the neighborhood council, and they're way, way huggier. I highlight this hugging variable in part because this is one of those things that we did not actually go into this study thinking we were going to include or track, but it was something that our observers came back after watching the first few waves of convenings and said, look, we definitely need a hug index in our research. This is something that is very dramatically distinguishing the kinds of convenings we're looking at. And so we started collecting it, and lo and behold, here it is. The hug index is a big indicator of variation across organizations. And it will be interesting to me to see how much this plays out in bigger studies over time. So quick findings on this then. CSOs can certainly vary substantially in their use of these three interaction styles, hugging, interrupting, and shouting. And the data bears that out for the other interaction styles that we collect as well. And this brings up a couple of new questions that we'll want to pursue. So one, do interaction styles influence the likelihood of ending discussions with clear decisions? So if you've got a situation where people interrupt each other a lot, does that derail conversation, or does that lead to a more productive discussion that eventually ends on a decision? If you're an organization that interrupts but doesn't hug, is it harder for you to sort of come to consensus? But if you're an interruptee and huggy organization, well, does that perhaps make it easier for you to reach consensus on things and come to a decision in the end? It will be really interesting over time to sort of see how these interactive dynamics play out in other convening level dynamics. And we'll also be interested in sort of organizational outcomes. So one way we could look at that would be, do interaction styles of these kinds influence the ability of organizations to recruit or retain participants? If you're a huggy or an interruptee or a shouty organization, does that mean people are more likely to show up and then leave? Do those kinds of things encourage people to stay? Those kinds of things we'll be able to look at when we get bigger samples and look over time. So with that, I'm clearly leading us on to other kinds of things that we want to do with this. So let me just wrap up by talking a little bit about what we see as the next steps for this. As I mentioned earlier, our next moves are really to try to leverage this technique to increase the number of cases so we can see distributions, and also connect data on internal dynamics to other kinds of data sources. Data sources on organizations so that we can test if internal dynamics shape organizational outcomes. And ideally down the road, we'd also like to find ways to collect data on individuals so we can see how internal organizational dynamics influence the sort of civic trajectory of the individuals who participate. Our immediate next step in that direction is going to be what we're calling the Bloomington study. We are located here in Bloomington, Indiana, and one thing that we would like to do is a much larger scale study of civil society organizations right here in our backyard. Our initial goal is to do a study of 50 organizations, collect data on those over the course of 2 years in a couple of waves, which should give us in the end something on the order of 1,500 convenings in our data set. We actually were pretty much ready to roll on a version of this study pre-COVID. We were just at the point of pulling our sample, and we were just about getting ready to start reaching out to organizations and getting them lined up. And then, COVID. So we had to put that on ice, and we're sort of getting that thought out now and starting to move on that again. Our hope is to get that project back up and running and started just as soon as it's safe to do so. The other sort of next step direction that we want to bring up is possibly your study. Part of the reason that I'm doing this talk and that I want to get this information out there is that we didn't just build this tool so that we can use it. I would like other people to use this technique and perhaps even to literally use the tool that we've developed to do studies for your own purposes. So if you find what I've had to say interesting, and this is something you'd like to explore further, reach out, talk to me about this. I'd be happy to talk more individually about the kinds of research questions you're asking, whether or not this data collection technique would be valuable for that kind of thing, and whether or not you'd like to try to develop your own or adapt or adopt the kinds of things that we've done here. As I said before, the technique is modular, right? We've got these different pieces, so you wouldn't necessarily have to implement the whole thing. Maybe there's just pieces of it that you would like to give a try, and we could go from there. If you want to do that, or you have further interest in this kind of thing, you can definitely keep tabs on what we're doing at our project website. It's OS for Observing Civic Engagement. .indiana.edu, and through that site you can reach out to us to ask about using the tool or just for additional insights on how you might develop this own kind of thing on your own. the website at the moment is a bit bare bones, but we'll be adding more to it over time. And most importantly, links to the papers that I talked about are there, as well as links to contact information for me and my collaborators, so you can reach out to us and we can talk more about that kind of thing. One of our long-run goals is that if and when people start adopting this technique, in addition to us collecting more data on our own, that we sort of develop a data sharing and warehousing program, so that when we're using these similar data collection tools in different places, we eventually sort of compile that data together to be able to answer more sort of comparative questions about what civil society dynamics look like in different places and at different times and in different settings. Before I wrap up, I just briefly want to acknowledge my collaborators. Like I said, this is a labor-intensive process, and there have been a lot of people who have been involved in this that could not have gotten through any of it without. Brad Fulton is my primary collaborator and co-principal investigator on the project that we're working on now, as well as on the project in Indianapolis. He's here at the O'Neill School at Indiana University with me. We've had a number of fantastic project managers, usually PhD students, many of whom have now gone off and are doing their own fascinating research in other areas and trying to perhaps use some of these techniques as well. And then we've had tons and tons of observers and analysts who've worked on the data. Their names are there on the screen. I wish I could go through all of them. They're wonderful, wonderful people. And if you ever encounter any of them, thank them for me again, because it really was essential to this. Also, I'd like to acknowledge my funders. We got funding for the student study from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, back when actually it was the Center on Philanthropy, and the Spencer Foundation. AmeriCorps, what used to be known as the Corporation for National and Community Service, funded the Indianapolis study. And I've gotten a bunch of other resources from the O'Neill School and other sources of money here at Indiana to help continue with things now. With that, let me conclude. I've argued over the course of this talk that research on civil society has long needed a way to get data on internal dynamics in CSOs at a scale large enough to see distributions and test relationships. While prior approaches to data collection have produced tremendous insights, I think the next big push is going to require new data collected in new ways that bridge the gap between the small and large N approaches of the past. Systematic social observation can, and in my opinion, should be one of the techniques that helps with that push. So in short, I think SSO is a data collection technique that will advance the study of civil society, and I hope you'll consider joining me in that effort. Thanks.
Thank you so much. All right, we are open to questions, and I see Shelly Ann has jumped in, and I actually just took a look at your paper. So using social network analysis to be able to sort of look at dynamics of domination in meetings, which is of course a very rich topic. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Shelly Ann, or to offer any kind of specific comment.
Sure. I just wanted to thank you, Matthew, for doing such a wonderful presentation and walking us through systematic social observation. We definitely learned a lot. And yeah, so my team and I were looking at guideline development meetings. So for clinical practice guidelines out there, looking at World Health Organization guideline development meetings there, and just looking at the interactions. So we thought it would be a really nice fit for us, and would definitely love to learn a little bit more about the tool and about how we could potentially be using this tool to collect some of our observation data. And that's something we've been very interested in. So really looking forward to learning more, and hopefully we can have another conversation about this as well.
Oh, that's great. I mean, yeah, that certainly sounds like the kind of setting that would allow for something like this. And I suspect that you could generate some really interesting data out of it. So yeah, by all means, please reach out. I'd love to talk to you one-on-one about that.
Thank you.
Stephanie.
Yeah, hello. I'd like to echo the fact too, I really enjoyed your presentation. Well done, and quite interested in some of the work you do, and I probably will read some of your papers. I'm just getting ourselves into the ethnography, so I'm very novel in it. We're an organization that actually produces educational material for family physicians, and these physicians actually work in small groups. And so we're kind of very much interested in terms of how some of that knowledge gets translated during small group discussions. One of my questions that I do have, and it looks like you have a huge team. Now, do you recruit people to do the observation? Are these mostly students? Are there faculty members? Are they trained in some way? And then the other question I have, how much training actually is involved to do these observations?
Yeah, great questions. So each new study, and really sort of oftentimes sort of during the studies, we have to recruit new people and bring them on. We have mostly used students because, those are the folks around us who are available and flexible,
right. Yeah.
That kind of thing. But certainly one could, there's no reason one has to be a student in order to do this. The training, generally speaking, takes, for our students, it usually takes about I would say 3 weeks or so, 3 to 4 weeks. Usually what we do is we start out having them do a little bit of reading on what the technique is and on what the sort of big research questions are that we're looking at, so they have some familiarity with the field. Then they take a good amount of time to look through the data collection form itself, and all the code book kind of stuff. We got to sort of work through questions that they have about what those things mean. Then we send them out to do some test observations. We usually try and find organizations that actually are not our sample organizations. And so one of the nice things about being on a university campus is those student organizations are always around. And so we find some friendly student organizations that are like, yes, of course you can come take data that's not going to go anywhere. And we have them sort of, practice that a few times. And that's usually really helpful because then sort of debriefing them on those, gives them a chance to be like, okay, so the difference between this code and this code is this, and these are the situations this applies. So, just the literal number of hours that it takes to train someone isn't that many, right? Maybe 15 or 20, but it's the scheduling of all those things and the sequencing of all those things that spreads it out over a few weeks. But once you get to that point, then, we send people out to the field. One thing that we found has been quite helpful is after an observation or after a couple of observations, having our sort of senior project manager, somebody who's done more of the observations and is more familiar with all of it, sort of just debrief each form as it comes in with people. Say, all right, so I've looked over these things and I just want to make sure, tell me what went on. And especially in the early going, that ensures data quality, that everybody's coding things in the right way. And then after about a month and a half of doing it, it's old hat. They pull out the iPads and they go on out and there's data comes in and they move on. So it works pretty well. If we had a system where, we had people who were working for us not on a semester system, it arguably would be easier because we would do less training and people would work for us.
No, that's great. So do you involve these people then in the analysis process too, or is it then the senior group that actually then does the analysis?
It sort of depends. So, we always invite and, welcome input from our observers. They're the ones who are close to what's going on in the field. And so we do debrief with them and we meet with them regularly to sort of, not only make sure that the tool is working, but, to sort of make sure that the process is working and that they still think that what we're getting is reflecting the reality that we're seeing. Beyond that, sort of once we get to sort of the technical analysis part, we're usually then looking at our sort of, PhD level research assistants who are doing more analytic work. But, as we're coming up with findings and things, we will run it by our teams of observers as well and say, all right, so this is what the patterns look like. Does this accord with your experience in the field? So it is still a fieldwork based, technique, and one that has, the benefits of the, not exactly the ethnographer, but the visitor who's there. So we don't want to lose those insights. And so wrapping those people into the analytic process as we go is also a big part of it. The extent to which that'll happen as we scale it up, 50 organizations is probably going to require 10, 12 observers in order to make that work. It'll get harder, but, the sort of PhD students that we have gotten to be project managers and manage those team of people have usually done a really great job of it. And so I think there's a way managerially for us to sort of set up the research team in a way to make it work.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Looks like we are just a little beyond time. Thank you so much, Matthew. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to him directly or to filter them through Talk to Spark at mcmaster.ca. We're also going to put up a link to a 1-minute feedback survey that helps us plan for future speakers. We really appreciate the feedback. And then visit our website for more Spark Talks. We do one every single week. Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you so much, Matthew.
Thanks again for having me. This was super fun.